Weeding. If there's one part of gardening that I don't enjoy, it's the weeding. The constant weeding. But there are a few ways to lessen the amount of time spent weeding in the garden and actually enjoying the garden instead. So I'm going to share a few of the tricks that I use to cut down on weeding in the garden. The first tactic I like to use in weed control is solarization. So this works really well if you're trying to establish a new garden plot or just get control of one that's out of control with weeds. I like to use big tarps or that black weed barrier fabric, but anything that's going to block out all of the light is going to help to kill off the weeds underneath. You want to leave this on for, I'd say, at least 3 weeks. The longer the better. And this tends to work really well, especially in the summer when that sun is really intense, because it burns off the weeds even more quickly. Now this will help kill off existing weeds as well as some of the dormant weed seeds that are lying in the soil, especially the ones that are closest to the surface. Now it won't get rid of everything, but it will drastically cut down on the amount of weeds that you're seeing. Now the next tactic that I like to use is a cardboard mulch. You can do the same thing with newspaper, and I like to utilize this in between my walkways and paths, not so much in the actual garden beds, but it does do an excellent job of cutting back weeds in the walkways. Now it's not the prettiest of solutions, so what I would usually do is then cover this up with another material. So you can see here in my pathways, I actually laid cardboard down on all of these first and then went over these with a wood chip mulch. And eventually this will all disintegrate into the soil and need revamped, but it does work to suppress the weeds for quite a while. So here you can see I've done the same thing with newspaper. I've laid the newspaper down first and then I'm covering it with some leaf mulch. Newspaper tends to be easier to work with if you lay it down and then give it a good spray with a garden hose. That just kind of keeps it down where it's supposed to be. But basically you just lay it all out, spray it, and then cover it with grass clippings, leaf mulch, wood chips, whatever you have on hand. One thing to keep in mind with newspaper is you want to opt for matte black and white newspaper print. Don't use this glossy colored stuff in the garden. One other option I like to use for walkways in addition to the wood chip mulch, if you have access to weed seed free straw or agricultural hay, it's a really nice option. Especially if you're doing a kind of no-till row type setting, because as that straw or hay biodegrades, it's going to add a lot of nice organic matter to the soil. And if you apply it in thick flakes, it really does a bang-up job of suppressing weeds. Now in terms of what I like to use in my actual beds around my plants, we're on a partially wooded lot, so we have a lot of leaves dropping in the fall. Luckily we have a leaf shredder bagger attachment on the mower, so in the fall we can just go around and collect all of those leaves. We usually put it in a big pile and just kind of let it set through the fall and winter, and in the spring I can pull up scoops and apply it to my garden beds. Another option I like to use is grass clippings. So same thing, you use that attachment and collect the grass clippings, making sure to mow before any weeds have put up seed heads, because you don't want to be adding more weed seed to your garden. But just collect that in a pile, and whenever I need it, I can come in and put that mulch around the plants. Now a new option I'm going to try out this year are these cocoa bean hulls. So these are the leftover hulls from the cocoa beans, obviously, and you can see it's just a real fine, light layer. And it does smell like chocolate. I kind of want to eat these. But interestingly enough, I did not realize when I bought this that it has pretty specific directions for use. So you're actually supposed to apply and then water these, and apparently the moisture makes them cohesive and they kind of stick together to form a mat. So I'm not sure where I'm going to utilize these yet. I'm thinking about more in my ornamental beds. And one thing to keep in mind with the cocoa bean mulch is that dogs and probably other animals are drawn to the smell and will tend to try to eat it. So you may want to keep that in mind if you've got dogs or other pets. I'm not sure if the shells are harmful to dogs. You know, you always hear that chocolate is not good for them to eat. I don't know about the shells, but I'm going to be using them in a place where my dog can't get at them, just to be safe. A few other things to keep in mind. The first being, mulch as soon as humanly possible after planting. So while you've still got a fresh, clean bed, get mulch on there. The longer you leave soil exposed, the more opportunity weeds have to emerge. So if you can get it mulched right away, you're really gonna cut down on that weed emergence a lot. The other thing is to learn a little bit about the problem weeds in your area, because that can tell you a lot about your soil and what conditions you're dealing with. A good example is Canadian thistle. Thistle tends to thrive in soil which is low in calcium and manganese and high in iron. Often the soil is compacted with poor residue decay and dominated by anaerobic bacteria. Thistles have an aggressive root system. Their main vertical root can reach 6 to 15 feet down into the ground, and the roots can spread horizontally for over 15 feet in any direction. This makes it very easy for them to spread and fill up an area. By improving the mineral imbalances and soil structure, you can often deter thistle growth. And the same thing goes for all weeds. If you can reverse the conditions that they're thriving in, it will help to get rid of them in the long run. The other aspect is that by knowing how a weed operates, so again, the thistle as an example, when thistles are going into flower, they're using up enormous amounts of reserves from their root system. So mowing at that time can be lethal for a thistle, because if you're mowing it down, especially a repeated mowing at that time, you're forcing it to use every bit of energy reserve it has in that taproot, and eventually it's not going to be able to thrive anymore. Now, if you want to learn more about the specifics of weeds, because there are so many and it's so specific to your area, there are some great books out there. This Weeds Control Without Poisons has been a very, very useful reference. This is by Charles Walters, and When Weeds Talk by Jay McCammon is also a very useful reference guide. Now, another option to consider for weed control is using cover crops in the garden. So you'll want to do, again, a little research on this, and I will link some really great resources in the notes below. But there are different cover crops that are going to be your best option for particular seasons, particular growing areas, and particular applications. So if you're looking for quick growth and weed suppression in the summer, things like buckwheat and sorghum Sudan grass are going to be really great options. If you're looking for cover in the fall and winter months, you're going to look at something like a rye, vetch, winter pea kind of a combination. You can look at fast growing crops for weed suppression. You can actually look to cut those down and use as a green mulch, and you can interplant between that as well. Now, cover crops a lot of times are referenced as, I think people think of them on a large scale plot or like on a farm or in a field, but it's really easy to utilize them in a small scale garden as well, even in like a raised bed scenario. I think buckwheat is one of the easiest cover crops to get started with because it thrives in the heat, it's extremely fast growing, and the blooms bring in pollinators as well. So it has a lot of benefits. Just as an example, you may have a raised bed that you grew, say your spring crops in, your broccoli, cabbage, things like that. You're going to want to give that a rest through the summer. You could throw a cover crop of buckwheat in there pretty easily and even cut it down several times or do several successive sowings. And that's going to keep weeds from taking over what would otherwise be an empty space through a whole season. So let me hear from you. What are your tricks for cutting down on weeds in the garden? I'd love to hear some new ideas. And if you find content like this helpful, please consider subscribing to my channel, Growfully with Jenna. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.